delighted to introduce Professor Tara Fenwick, who is going to give us, I think, a slightly different view and a different perspective, because Tara is Professor of Professional Education at the University of Stirling. So she's taking us out of the built environment kind of comfort box, I think. Her research focuses on professionals changing work and learning in work, with particular interest in socio-material theories of practice and knowledge. Our current projects examine interprofessional practice in emergency mental health care, new demands of professional responsibility, and rethinking ways of learning through simulation. Tara is Director of Propel, which is an international network for research in professional practice, education and learning based at the University of Stirling. She's a member of the ESRC Council, and she currently chairs the ESRC Training and Skills Committee. So, welcome.
Thanks, Barbara. Well, first I'd like to thank Sam and Barbara and the team for inviting me. It's a real pleasure and honor, and I'm learning a great deal about an area I don't know much about, the built environment area. I just want to add a couple of things to what Barbara said, and thank you for the introduction. I have only been in Scotland 4 years. I moved here from Canada, where I had all of my career until this point. And I am embarrassed to say that although while I was in Canada, I frequently came over to Europe, and especially the UK, for work, it wasn't until I moved here that I realized just how different things are here than they are in, I'll say, Canada, but I'm sure many of you would say, well, you could say that about North America as well, and I can expand on that later if you're interested, but it definitely affects the work I do, which is on professions across the disciplines. So the work we do particularly looks at public sector professions. Healthcare, social care, education, policing are the main areas we do work. And I haven't done a lot of work, I have to say, with architects, planners, and engineers, civil engineers in particular. So I'm interested in whether you find what I have to say as applicable to the kinds of professions you're interested in. The work we do, as Barbara said, is based out of this large network that I direct, which is devoted to not just professional learning, that's my area of research, is learning in practice, but also professional education. So a lot of what we do is intended to inform the education of incoming professionals. And we've already heard a fair bit about that today, but I'll come back to that at the end of the day. But also, how do we help people in practice learn? And not just the professionals, but all of the people they work with. And I would say that a lot of the speakers talk so far have focused on that. So I'm going to start by going back to something Ian Cooper began with, which was defining professionalism. I want to spend a little bit of time on this, because it's something we think we all know, and I'm going to remind you of things you've seen many times, but it's worth going back and just challenging ourselves with things that we thought were long-solved answers. Then I'm going to look at the whole notion of social responsibility, if you like, or civic responsibility in professionalism. And I'll end with what this might mean for training professionals, if you like, or encouraging cultural change, as the previous speaker, Craig McLaren, was just talking about, as other room was introduced. Professions these days pretty much all identify their work in this term. It's not about how do you apply protocols we learned back in university to incoming problems. It is about obviously managing the non-routine and unstructured problems, how to manage complexity. But what most professions will say now is that complexity has intensified and accelerated for lots of reasons that you've heard about already. Fast-changing demographics and changing technologies, and I would say resource cuts in the extreme, especially here in the UK, are some of the obvious issues. But it's managing this dynamic complexity while guaranteeing quality and competent service. And this is where you get locked into this contradiction for professionals of there's massive unpredictability, but trying to work down a line of certainty, vision, and measurement, as Craig McLaren was talking about. That, I suppose, is one way of framing the whole question. But I also want to remind us that we are talking now about the incoming professionals. And we've all seen lists like this, the so-called 21st century digital native incoming undergraduate. Obviously, not all of them, many of you have taught these sorts of people, not all of them have these kinds of characteristics. However, many of them do, and particularly, these are ones we know we're seeing are radically changing the ways our new professionals want to approach practice. They are born into social media. They are network-oriented. They don't have to be taught networks. In fact, many of them find it hard to understand why we're even talking about bridging silos, because they weren't born into silo thinking or programmed thinking. They have lived their lives up until their undergraduate professional training in a very different way of understanding knowledge. And finally, they are accustomed to interactivity. They have always spoken back to authorities, newspapers, textbooks, and so on. They're used to having their say, which changes, perhaps automatically, some of the issues that we're struggling with. I want to go back to something Ian Cooper was talking about at the opening of this afternoon, defining professionalism. Professionalism, bottom line, is a contract of trust. All sorts of things that Ian was mentioning, which is this issue of status and the right to self-regulate and authority of knowledge, only comes with the guarantee. And that's guaranteed not necessarily of social responsibility or all sorts of altruistic things. It's a guarantee of this quality service, however that's been defined for professionalism. And the mappings of knowledge and so on that Ian talked about come under the guarantee of quality service, which may have nothing to do with the sorts of ethics that we think all professionals should be bound to. It's about warranty of their service. And I want to just expand this a little bit. First, here are the key challenges that across the professions we work with would more or less apply to the work and education they're trying to do. So this is health, social care, policing, public sector. Obviously conflicting demands, which I'll come back to. But this fast-changing knowledge base and this increasing focus on evidence-based practice. In Scotland, for example, we now have one police service, as many of you will know, made out of, in a very quick fashion, 8 constabularies, and a huge emphasis on evidence-based practice for the first time, meaning training officers all over Scotland on how to recognize what's quality evidence, how to use it in a way that's meaningful for the situations they have in front of them. Digital technologies, we know, are radically changing practice. Partnership work we've heard a lot about. We call this interprofessional work or what have you. I'll come back to that later. Increased audit, I would say, especially in the UK, is something that is, I think many professions say, handcuffing the work they're doing. And Craig talked about this struggle between the different roles, and particularly the regulatory function and the visionary functions, which at some point fundamentally conflict with one another, and the audit is picking up on one of those. And I don't need to tell you which one it is. The declining public trust, a lot of this is driving scandal, which then causes professionals to react in particular ways, and increased social anxiety, which I'll just draw your attention to the last bullet here. Some have said that in professions these days in the public sector, we're seeing dumped onto them really what is a projection of societal anxiety and guilt over massive problems that they can't see the solutions to. So the professions more and more are finding themselves having to increase their level of responsibility to handle what in the first place may not be a fair set of demands. So it's something to think about before we jump into new responsibilities for professionals. But I do want to just go back to some of these conflicts, like this first issue of the legal obligation to the client and the broader needs of society. Now, Ian, just make sure I get the name pronounced correctly, Gilsey, talked about this a fair bit, and what I've heard him say is that engineers have it sort of the right way around, that the client's interests should never trump the interests of society. But there's more interest than that at stake. Think of the nurse on the ward with 15 beds and meds to do in 15 minutes. And of that 15, she has 1 minute per patient. And one patient is in severe distress. Now this is the one versus the many, just in looking at clients, that professionals have to deal with all the time. Hospital audit procedures do not allow an additional 10 minutes to spend with that elderly patient who's confused and in distress. That's just about the patients. Then you step back to the broader needs of society that often get registered in a whole series of audit measures that many of you who read the Francis report about healthcare know brought down the whole system. The nurses, one of the biggest complaints, were so busy filling out multiple forms that they were ignoring panic buttons of the patients all the time. You could say, well, that's fulfilling the societal needs and sacrifice the client's needs. This is just one of the conflicts that professionals are dealing with. The third bullet is an important one that I want to go to next, is this requirement that professionals add onto their lists of musts all kinds of new virtue obligations. The professional should be honest and ethical and integral and should now take on social responsibility and should be a global citizen. We're getting these lists, especially in the, say, more vulnerable professions like teaching and social work, to a point where society is almost demanding that they take on large categories of virtues that, again, don't have much to do with their original contract. So this leads us to what many writers are saying is not just a definition of professionalism. What we have are different discourses of professionalism that are being used to regulate and control professionals, not to unleash new opportunities for them. So some of the top things you'll recognize where professionals, think of movies, films, and how they portray professionals as the incoming hero, as the wonderful nurturing caregiver, and so on. I could give you all sorts of icons of professionalism that society has come to take on as quite natural. Down below were the kinds of things that I end up teaching our students about what is professionalism. All kinds of typologies and continuas and demands, from restricted to extended professionalism to transformative versus regulatory professionalism. It goes on ad nauseum. The latest one that's come in is civic professionalism, and now we hear today there's something called new professionalism, and it will keep going on. New discourses, mainly to meet a lot of needs that perhaps didn't come out of the actual contract that the profession signed up to in the first place. So this leads us to this web of commitments, and I encourage you to remember Ian Cooper's wonderful picture of John Stannard's list of stakeholders that had to be consulted for Liverpool One. And if you looked at all those little boxes, as Ian pointed out, you saw not just different groups, but groups with fundamentally contested interests. That's just one of the web of commitments that professions are involved in. The other is the employers. And we've got research now that shows that professionals are often very caught between the demands of their profession, which is to provide a certain warranty of service, certain kinds of planning and so on, and the demands of the employer, which often come down to things like measurable outputs, which may not link up with the demands of the profession. Then there's all sorts of other demands, the relational commitments that professionals feel. We're finding more and more professionals feel much more bound to the person they meet one-to-one with and form a relationship with than they do with a whole lot of other stakeholders that their profession may feel bound to, which changes the way they will make their decisions. Interprofessional practice I'll come back to later and the issues with that. But overall, what Louis May is one of the theorists on professional responsibility, and most of us are using this now as a way to go forward, is to say there is no single way of defining responsibility other than as a series of legitimate compromises. All professional responsibility will come down to the ultimate compromise. And the final thing I'll say about responsibility, because there's been so much written about this in professional practice. Our new professionals usually get handed a code of ethics, and Ian Cooper had a wonderful slide on this, if you remember, about what codes of ethics are worth. And I want to say, by the way, that hairstylists have their own codes of ethics, and they're actually worth I just did. But the notion of responsibility is almost given to new professionals as though give them a code of ethics, and now they will apply it. They will take the rule, and they'll apply it in practice. But actually, when we analyze how professionals enact responsibility, and I challenge you to think about this in your own practice, is this true for you? They do not apply codes and rules very rationally to practice. They react to all kinds of things, rationally, but embodied things, political issues, all kinds of ways of measuring up and weighing up the priorities of the different clients in front of them, and so on. So that responsibility is rarely this rational application of all of these things. It's something else. And nobody will say, well, it's just plunging in blind. No. But there's something of that in the way we enact responsibility in daily practice that we need to attend to and to help our students see. So some have said, actually, when you look at what some professionals are doing these days, given the demands and the conflicts in those demands, it is impossible practices. It is leaping into what is more and more set of uncertainties. And the more we insist on mapping it all into neat little strategy plans, the more we handcuff new people in believing that's actually how it works. So the work we're trying to do is map what professionals do in practice. What are the knowledges that they create in practice? And how then can we better educate incoming professionals that reflect that? So let me turn now to this whole question of, for want of a better term, civic responsibility. Because now there's so much talk about this. What is civic responsibility? Well, I'll give you a few examples. Coming out of the States, and more affecting what we do in Europe, is this injunction to teach civic professionalism. So there's coursework, there's modules, there's sets of standards that's about civic professionalism, and I'll sort of give some more detail about that in a moment. But let me just give another example of the kinds of things that are going on. Engineering bodies themselves, professional bodies themselves, led by engineers, are forming groups for social responsibility, where they define initiatives for themselves that go beyond the standards of practice, that are much more about contributing to the greater social good, contributing to civic responsibility. So these are forming all over. A lot of them aren't enshrined in standards or measures of success, but they're being taken up by individuals. What is this all about? Well, there's three main things. Let me just take this, another example. We've heard about collaboration. Ian Gilzeed and Craig McLaren both talked a lot about this emphasis on collaboration. In the UK, the language used is sometimes partnership work, sometimes co-production. Co-production in health and social care is now a policy requirement. So for areas like child protection, i.e. children in neglect, vulnerable children, health and social care agencies must work interprofessionally. We also see this with aged care, and we see it with mental health care and so on. What has this led to? Partnership sounds wonderful. Collaboration sounds like we all know how to do it, right? We just hold hands and be nice to each other. What we have found in the studies of interprofessional and partnership work or co-production, all the same, we have found that professionals are very, very concerned when they go into these arrangements for a number of reasons. In our studies, what we found is they're very worried about losing their own professional identity. They're worried about losing accountability, because when you have different professionals going into the same problem, they often come with very different views of what's the priority problem to be tackled here. They also come in with very different logics of practice. And I'll take you back to Ian Cooper's wonderful term, false friends. Remember his notion of false friends? Those categories that we think we all know. I think he used the word design. So for us, it would be things like collaboration has very different meanings for different professionals. Safety has very different meanings. And when you put professionals together, the whole question is great until bad things happen. And then it's who's accountable for what here? And how did we get so blurred? And one of the biggest issues we find is that a lot of partnership work, things fall between the cracks very easily because actually nobody is responsible for certain things happening. So there's lots more work to look at before we simply say, let's collaborate. Yes, we should, but let's look at what's involved there. So other things about civic responsibility, there's 3 main areas that have been taken up by other professions, I think, across the board, in varying degrees in the UK or in North America. The first is this whole emphasis on social justice, if you like, and equity, which is all these sorts of things. It's about looking at power relations. It's not just about working for the greater good out there. It's about personally looking at how is my income and status structured? And how am I, as a white, wealthy, well-paid, living in a very wealthy country, how am I configured in relation to the others that I work with? And what does it mean when I walk into a community group? And how am I perceived? And what am I listening to about the knowledges around me? It's all that kind of stuff. You know about this. Social workers have this embedded in their standard of practice. They define themselves according to issues of social justice. Teachers more and more take this on, although it's not a standard of practice. The next one, which I heard a lot about today already, is this emphasis on ecological sustainability, not just in one's projects, but in how one works oneself and in how one's organization works. So professional firms have been very influenced, it's fair to say, by the discourses of corporate social responsibility to do all of these kinds of things. Other professions are taking this on as well. Healthcare is now getting groups of clinicians around to say, are we sustainable in the way we even work? Not economic sustainability, ecological sustainability. And the final one is another one of these baggy category words or false friend categories, global citizenship. The teachers in Scotland in particular have this written into what they must pervade because they have to teach Scottish children global citizenship, whatever this means. Usually, you know, about these kinds of things. Medical professionals in Canada now have this built into their standards of practice, that they will be enacting practice that doesn't just serve the clients and the healthcare needs of society, but that responds to demands of global citizenship. Nobody's too sure what happens when these kinds of demands begin conflicting with the needs of the elderly person in distress right in front of you. But this is what's in the ether, if you like, coming up. So what does all this mean if we take on this list from professions? It's these sorts of things to sort of summarize them all. And my guess is we're going to be giving these slides to Hussam, so that if you want to go back and look them up, you can. So I won't walk through them all. But it is about not just getting the others you work with to act in these sorts of ways. It's fundamentally looking at the structures of one's own work to act in these sorts of ways. So for us, as educators, and maybe for some of you who are also at times called upon to educate incoming professionals, these are the things that are happening now. Not everywhere, and not all the time, and not equally in the list, but definitely we're seeing this happening. So this is something we take most of our education and social work professionals through as a general part of education. This whole exercise of, it's part of critical pedagogy of leading professionals through actually looking at systemic problems and connecting their personal practice with it, and then critically analyzing the power relations and the politics as they play out. Community-engaged service learning is something that I've done a fair bit of work about myself, but this is moving beyond taking your incoming professionals and sending them out to the community to do something for 3 months. It's far more now about universities themselves and professional firms engaging with communities to set up meaningful projects that the community defines. And that's the essence of co-production. It's not about consulting with the community. The community is co-defining what the projects are in the delivery and planning of them. Getting young professionals, the medics are doing this in Scotland all over now, engaged in little action research projects in hospitals, in clinics, that don't just improve practice, but take on these issues of global and social responsibility, working with the patient and client groups that are there. And finally, many of us are experimenting with pedagogies borrowing from complexity theory. How do we actually create emergence in our teaching situations? How do we loosen up the lecture theater? I mean, many of our teaching still happens in lecture theaters. How do we get out of here and take them into areas where they're actually experiencing disturbance and working with the other elements of complexity that they will? There's questions, though, with this. Just going to check my time. Let me just run through these quickly. This is not to undermine everything I've said. It's just to say, in going forward, let's not be naive. Let's keep asking the questions that can undo a lot of the efforts. So an obvious question is this all just another discourse? It's very altruistic, but that turns into a checklist of you must, you will, you won't kind of things for new professionals. Does this not raise questions about whose virtues now are being imposed? And how do you rationalize these? As soon as you say, well, it's inherently a good thing, collaboration, inherently a good thing, you'll find that there's a whole lot of audiences that can show you lots of reasons why it's not inherently a good thing. This whole question of the scope, where does it stop, this notion of civic responsibility or social responsibility? New professionals will want to know this because they know they're being measured on this. Whose demands? And if we look back at that web of commitments, and I'll never forget that list that Ian showed us of all those groups that John Stoddard had to connect with, and then add into that patients and clients and relationships. Now add in the civic. Where do you begin as a professional in that web of commitments? And are we not, yet going back to that notion of dumping demands, our societal anxieties and guilts for more collaboration, more civic, do something about the environment, are we not inflating professionals to symbolic importance? And at the same time, are we not focusing on one set of people in this whole equation? And we've talked about stakeholders and professions, and earlier today we saw that wonderful slide of this sort of uniform group. You have to take that apart and say, who else is in this who shares responsibilities with the professions, and how do we bring them on board in educating? So the question that I go away with, and that my students and my colleagues, researchers internationally are working on, is this one. How to encourage and support collective practices, not just professional practices, but professional with who? Critically, non-naively, and meaningfully, towards this expanded sense of responsibility. Thank you.
Can I ask the speakers just to come and have a seat, please, and we'll ask my colleague from Architecture Design Scotland, Eric, to facilitate the questions. I'm afraid we will have only 10 minutes for questions before we give the stage from again for Ian Cooper to explain the workshop for afternoon. And if I may say, if you have any question, just say who you are and where you're coming from as well.
Thanks very much. When Sam invited me to take over from Dermot, who sent his apologies, I explained why it wasn't a good idea that I wasn't the right man for the job, so I now intend to prove just exactly that. Four fantastic presentations. Can we invite any questions, please? How does this work? With a roving mic? Yes. Questions, please? One over here, Eugene.
Well, when I met Eric on the train, I promised him I would ask a question. My name is Eugene Mola. I'm an architect and urban designer in private practice in Edinburgh. My question is for Tara. I do very much appreciate what you said about demands of the profession in relation to the demands of our employers or our clients, and in particular the legal, professional indemnity, implications of all that in the current sort of procurement world we live in. It seems to me there's a paradox between this notion that professionals were people with knowledge, and that brought with it trust and gave people comfort, and that actually now this whole situation is sort of undermined with a lack of respect for professionals, and leads to a situation of who do you trust, and so on scope for sort of significant additional concern and insecurity. And I suppose really the question is there any role for professionals now? Is it an old idea, and is it no longer valid in terms of our civic responsibility and placemaking?
Hello? Yeah, it is. Thank you for the question. I think that's a really key issue. There are some who argue, and you can Google this to find it, that we're in an age of post-professionalism. I don't support that argument personally because the professionals, and this changes in different countries, but I would say in the UK, we have a firm Anglo notion of professionals, and they play a hugely important role in, say, the third way between state and market, and that they're embedded in that. And Ian showed that structurally, professionals are embedded there. They aren't so easily unearthed. And I think, one thing you could say facetiously is that the public know that, so they can get as anxious and as dismissive and as negative about professionals as they want, because they know they're not going to actually risk dissolving them altogether. That's a speculative sort of comment. But I think the broader issue you're saying is the fundamental one about what happens to professional knowledge then. Because if public are distrusting, and that's where the distrust comes, is that we know what we're doing and that our knowledge can be trusted because, hey, they can go on the internet and can find out what we know and how we know what we know. And by the way, they can find several opinions that will refute what we say is the right thing. That's the piece, I think. And so and some of us would argue, well, this is the space to change. And this is where we begin to move in the future, of moving away from protecting or closing, to use Ian's nice word, professionals, closing their knowledge and saying, we own this knowledge and we will sell it to you for a very high price. That is the piece that can change. To say, actually, we come with a set of strategies, a set of skills and competences that are very useful to you, and we can guarantee those, but we need to work with your knowings and knowledge towards something new. And that, I think, is the piece that perhaps is the reconfiguration of professionalism as we've known it up till now. But thank you, that's a great opening question.
Can I respond to it? Pat Healy used to say, when she was professor of planning at Newcastle University, that certainly in the 60s and the 70s, the role of planners was to arbitrate between competing interests. It was their job to try to balance solutions so that one side didn't win at the expense of another. I attended a presentation on the continent recently where a professor of planning said that the major role that planners now appear to play in Europe is to act as a way of assembling land that is large enough to interest developers to invest in. And what we can see here is that this relates not to the trusted knowledge that professionals have, but to whose benefit they apply that knowledge. And I think this comes back to the issue that you raised. Before we started, Tara said to me, do you think the understanding I have applies to this domain? And I think the answer is it clearly does. And that notion of to whose benefit, I think is a really key one. And I think it's as difficult to solve as the one between do you act in a way that shows civic responsibility or delivers what your employer requires. And I wanted to ask you a question about that last one, which is, and do we have any concrete evidence of how this plays out in the real world? Are there already test cases where professions have been litigation perhaps about whether or not they should be delivering what their employer wants or what their civic responsibility is?
I can answer that myself. None that I'm aware. I'm sure they exist, but I haven't come across them yet.
Nope. Sorry, second question. Thank you.
David Kirk, I'm retired. I'm a retired member of the Royal Planning Institute. absolutely great presentations, and I want you to think back about Ian Craig McLaren's presentation. Both of them were strongly advocating public sector leadership in their presentations, and yet one thinks that the professionals in the built environment increasingly are going to be finding employment in the private sector. And then the closing slide, which is an excellent one, collective practices of civic responsibility. Collective practices, where do publicly employed, privately employed, and people like me, not employed, share collective arenas to make this kind of progress in terms of thinking about our roles.
So you didn't quite get the question, David.
The question, do I need this? The whereabouts do we, where do professionals, whether employed in the public sector or the private sector, gain this collective learning, exposure to collective experience, and from that learning, because they're serving different masters with very different, as Ian's just described, very different agendas.
I mean, I think one of the things, I suppose it came across in Craig's presentation, is because he is representing the RTBI, he's speaking on behalf of professions, so there is that issue about, I don't think it's really been touched on to a great extent. I think a lot of discussion has been about the professional as an individual working for a client, but there is the profession as a collective body and how it communicates that knowledge, how it communicates with the wider world, and that's where I would say the private sector, public sector architects can come together with the professional bodies and so on to examine the sort of issues that have been talked about, where the kind of the messages and I suppose the kind of ideas that inform the profession can be communicated to a wider audience. I'm not sure if that's answering the question, but I think it is important. It's also important for the professions to do the sort of things we're talking about, which is reflect on the new challenges, and that's what we did with our workshops earlier in the year, which were quite interesting, and a lot of the stuff that's come out in the presentations here were covered in terms of certainly the impact of the kind of the graduates coming in. They're much more mobile, networked, keen to get going with things. I mean, I suppose in the past you would maybe go into whether it was public sector or private sector, spend a bit of time almost doing an apprenticeship. People don't want to hang around. Partly because of maybe the job opportunities aren't there. They just want to go and get on with things. That's my impression. But I think that's the sort of thing we should try and support, because there's a kind of can-do attitude. There's ability to make things happen, ability to directly engage with communities and almost bypass that client, very specific client relationship, trying to your own way of practicing. And that, in a sense, is more like a kind of studio approach as opposed to a professional approach.
I think that you can see that the Geddes Institute is attempting to answer your question, which is that master planning, placemaking, and building sustainable communities are essentially spaces in which that kind of activity should occur. The question is, do these spaces really exist? And to what extent can they be occupied and effectively supported by professionals in their everyday working practices? I guess that's a question that Sam and others are trying to supply an answer to. But there must be parallels in other professional domains about the extent to which these spaces exist or have to be created so they can be occupied.
Yeah, I think there's multiple answers answers to that, but just going back to the notion of where the professional body sits, I think that's an important thing to bring forward, because not all professional bodies are interested in things other than protecting their own interests or protecting their members, and many do get caught up in issues of pay and conditions, or in fighting battles of their own, which is about professional closure and guarding professional boundaries. And the whole sort of notion of should you expand what you're doing is seen as a threat to the very definition of the profession, which they would not be seen as something that they take up. So I think the professional body in this is a really important. Are there spaces of this? Yes, all over. And they're created in different ways. I have to say the ones I'm most familiar with aren't typically created at the high level of the big partnering agencies creating them. Often those partnering can perhaps open policy spaces for things to happen. But as I think we all know, when you actually see things happen, it tends to come from grassroots activity, where people from a variety of domains are getting together, working things out. The question is, do they have the space then to move forward? And that's where the policy domains are really important, and the resources to actually move forward.
It was a really interesting discussion at the cross-party group, architecture cross-party group Parliament the other week, where they were talking about the community empowerment bill and the role of communities in actively shaping politics. And one of the presentations was around this idea that you have different communities and you also have different opportunities to do that. But I suppose one of the big things that came out again was this notion that if we're talking about place, then everybody is a placemaker. Everyone has a role, everyone has a responsibility. So I suppose that's kind of get to the heart of, for me anyway, some of this notion about, is this the territory of the professional, or is this the territory of everyone, and what's the democratic right to participate, and what is the equality? And I just wanted to, I've been trying to get this up. I know this is a bit of a liberty, but I was Professional Conduct Code of the RTPI, members of the RTPI bound by professional conduct, which dictates that every member acts with competence, honesty, integrity, exercise independent professional judgment at all times, requires members to promote equality of opportunity, and so on and so forth. So the point being that they are expected to act in the wider common good, the public interest. I'm kind of fascinated by this notion of the false friends, these promises. That was just a bit on the side. I felt as though I talked or something, or being asked to stand here. Alan, are you keen to ask a question?
Yes.
I'm actually keen to try to be involved if I can. You'll know that, I'm just sticking to time in that case. It's just, just to get the panel's views. When I came in and I looked at the 8 memoir sheet and it said, what evidence is there that professional culture and practice has changed in response to calls for better placement? And I thought, how do you start to answer that in this sense? What is better placement? The professionals that work in the environment, I don't think we are clear on that yet. We need to be. I'm not. It's not an attack on the idea, but I don't think we're clear enough about it yet. So I remember when I first read, I think Ian Young was better. I think it was probably Designing Places, where the attempt there is to define the qualities of a successful place. And I remember thinking, well, Bangalore's Lower Manhattan and New York, two places I would love to work in, because they wouldn't have fit all of those qualities. But so this idea that there are better places, but what are those places? What's the found? And I kind of think that's what we need to focus on rather than professionals. If you allow me just to take it a little bit further, because every time I kind of go down this kind of confession route, Ian always manages to grab me out and drag me out, because he always gets, you can guarantee this at some point in his presentation, but he'll start talking about the use of charrettes to get people involved in this. But that's the real value of that. What those are doing are bringing all kinds of people, community representatives, professionals, everybody who's got an interest in it, into a room and starting a dialogue. And I kind of think that's what we need to be focusing on, and we need to get better understand what we mean by better places that accommodates all kinds of value judgments around that. how we get more people involved in it. Then we start to talk about professions. But even at that stage, I'm not sure we should ask them about how much they buy into this. I take sort of kind of comfort in the work that people like Jürgen Habermas and Bernard Marcuse used to do back in the 70s, which was about persuading professionals to demystify what it is they do. So get them into a dialogue and force them to engage, or oblige them to engage, or encourage them to engage, and then stop worrying about what they do and start worrying about the nature of the dialogue that creates the idea of what a better place is and what that better place might look like as we start to get it right. So I wonder just whether or not this is the right focus. And I'm perfectly prepared to be told I'm totally wrong on that, but I really would like to know what the panel's using it.
We would like to tell Alan he's totally wrong.
I think the question about what's a good place, it's always going to ask. We're always going to be asking that question for professionals. There's always, trying to say, there's always going to be new challenges in terms of how we deliver that. But I think there are things that I was trying to get at, which is that if we are mostly an urbanised society, then our focus should be on what makes a good urban place. And it doesn't necessarily mean low density. It can be high density. It's how we make that work. And I think in Melbourne, that's where the challenges up there are facing, is that they're almost becoming victims of their own success. And how you go from two different typologies of a very high dense centre and a very low density outer ring, how do you reconcile? So where do they go next? So there's always going to be these kind of challenges. And I think the charrettes, what I was saying about charrettes, yeah, it's important, and I think it's interesting that we've been able to take that programme forward to the extent we have. And what needs to happen now, if we're taking that forward, is that it goes beyond the charrette into community empowerment. It goes into getting professionals working in co-production situations to deliver and take these ideas forward. So if we've kind of come up with an idea of what would make this place better, then we've got the tools through the planning system, but also in terms of whatever mechanisms are there to deliver that and follow the process through. So I think that kind of idea of co-production and co-design and so on are really important and all their role. And I think that custom build, for example, a different way of doing it, and I'd like to see more experimentation around that. And just to finish, the Melbourne example, for example, to get people to come and live in Melbourne in the first instance, because nobody was interested, they went out and they found 700 people who said they might be interested, and they gave them tiny incentives. Like if you pay before the work's done, you get here, you don't have to pay for the planning and building control fees and stuff like that. But and then that was it. You've got 700. That's the ball rolling. So could we get the same sort of group of people who are interested in new models of delivering housing, for example, new ways of thinking about it? So that's what I would say. I think one of the things you've got to be as a profession is optimistic. I think that's not right, especially given the complexities, especially given everything that we have to deal with. We have to kind of keep, and I think uniquely about, I don't know, maybe it's not even, but the past and future thing with the Venice Biennale, we are a profession that's focused on the future, but everything around us and what we're dealing with is the past. It's an amazing kind of profession that you have to think about how you build on the best of the past and make that your future.
Any other?
I think that's precisely what we should be focusing on. This idea of community involvement, community empowerment, professionals supporting that.
Okay, community involvement, community empowerment, dialogue. I think that's probably the right time to thank very much for the questions. We're going to go in, and I'm sure we'll pursue some of these issues in our group discussions. So I think we're about to be told how that's going to now work. So thank you very much.
Thank you for your answer. I think that the questions that the Geddes Institute are setting are very, very difficult, and they do need to be unpacked. And I'd like to think that you can capture quite a bit of what you said in the space that's available to you on that sheet. So Okay. Okay, in the discussion groups, we needed to acknowledge that the questions that the Geddes Institute set for you were very difficult and probably impossible for you to unpack and try to answer together in the time available. And so what we're going to do is to ask you to address what seems to be a set of simpler questions. I doubt that they will be. Okay, so what we're going to do is to let you go to your coffee break, but then immediately ask you to work in your groups. So we will direct you to join your group in the space indicated, and you are being allowed to take your coffee with you.